Welcome your bodies. We welcome all the intellectual inquiry you bring to this space. We welcome the fantastic experiences that have curated the you that you are. Welcome. WSR Speaks is an initiative that is a student-led initiative in the Women's Studies in Religion program here at the GTU, and we are excited and thrilled to have Dr. Cleveland in conversation with Kiana Lazenby today. Without further ado, I'd love to welcome Kiana. Kiana, would you want to come on and just introduce yourself very briefly? And then, of course, introduce our esteemed guests and take it away in a very meaningful conversation that we're going to have in this hour. Thank you so much all for your presence, and thank you, Dr. Cleveland, for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Dr. Majibi. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kiana Sakil Lazenby. I'm a fourth-year PhD student here at the Graduate Theological Union. My research interests include African cosmological traditions, eco-womanism, comparative ethics, and practical theology. I am the founder of Divine She, a women's interfaith ministry that focuses on self-actualization, and also initiated priestess in the Ifa Asheshe Yoruba tradition. And so joining me in conversations today is our esteemed guest, Dr. Christena Cleveland, excuse me. Why this conversation? The sacred Black feminine has largely been suppressed in traditional religious spaces and the academy. Our guest today, Dr. Christena Cleveland, has created a path to explore how the sacred Black feminine is available to all who seek to know her. Yes, so let's get started. Briefly, Dr. Cleveland, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Christena Cleveland. I'm honored to be here with you all today. I'm a social psychologist and a public theologian and an activist, and I do a lot of work at the intersection of Black liberation and the divine feminine. So this is a great place for me to hang out today, and I'm honored to be here.
Thank you so much. So for our audience, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat box, and we will do our best to answer them at the conclusion of our conversation. Dr. Cleveland, in your book, God is a Black Woman, you share how cultivating a relationship with the sacred Black feminine saved you when facing challenges in your spiritual community. Could you please provide a working definition of the sacred Black feminine?
Sure. The sacred Black feminine is the streams, is a collective stream of all of the ways in which religions and spiritualities, past and present, all around the globe, are connecting with the sacredness in Blackness and also the sacredness in femininity. So one example that I've worked a lot with is the Black Madonna, who comes primarily out of Catholic traditions, but the Shekinah in Jewish and even Judeo-Christian traditions would also be sacred Black feminine, Tara in Buddhism, Kali in Hinduism. And then there's so many, Oshun, so many examples of the sacred Black feminine. And I just created that as an umbrella term, recognizing that I couldn't think of, I wasn't aware, there could be another umbrella term, but I wasn't aware of it. And in my research, I didn't find one. And I was wanting to embrace Blackness and femininity without suggesting that it's a mammy character or a magical character. So I was careful with the language. It can obviously still be misused, but I wanted to call her sacred instead of like magical or the divine or God in another way. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
How has the embodiment of the sacred Black feminine led to your own salvation and liberation, both intimately and professionally?
You know, what's interesting is comparative religious scholars might have other perspectives on this, but in the work that I've done in exploring some of the streams of the sacred Black feminine and across religions and spiritualities, the thing that seems a common thread is the embodiment of practice. When people connect, I spent maybe a month with candomblé priestesses in northeastern Brazil. And got to learn about how everything they do is embodied. It's not a head. There's no systematic theology of the sacred Black feminine, and that's common with a lot of divine feminine. But I think when you add Blackness to it, particularly Black femininity is very practical, is all about making a way out of no way, and you actually see that within these spiritual practices. And specifically with the Black Madonna, who I've spent the most time with, pilgrimage to the Black Madonna is to worship the Black Madonna. You can't separate the two. People who are serious devotees of the Black Madonna, pilgrimage to her either physically or in a spiritual way, but pilgrimage, going and spending time with her, is really important. And as someone who grew up in a Christian, like kind of Western Christian background, it was all about memorizing scripture. And if there was any connection to the body, it was in subduing the body. Whereas the Black Madonna of Montserrat, who's one of the most famous Black Madonnas, she's outside Barcelona in Spain. She's the second most visited pilgrimage site in the history of Christianity. The only pilgrimage that's more popular or more people have done is the Santiago de Camino. And that one has 19 Black Madonnas along it, and it starts at a Black Madonna in France. So, there seems to be this sense of deep embodiment. And even right now, I'm taking a class on Tara in the Buddhist tradition. And as part of the class, we were all sent a carnelian stone, because central to the practice of connecting with Tara is holding the stone in your hand as you're chanting. And so the embodiment piece seemed so central to adoration and to worship that it made me really start to question how disembodied my Black female body had been trained to be as a Black American. And so I was commenting to Kiana right before we started that, I'm excited that the weather is pretty great today because I want to go for a walk, because that's a practice that I do now that I didn't do before I connected to the sacred Black feminine, because now I can see that connecting with the earth and connecting with the air and connecting with my body is also worship.
Shay, thank you.
Mm.
Could you please explain, because these are some of the things that I picked up in your book, God is a Black Woman, and I'm also teaching your book in my Introduction to African Religions course at the Star King. Yes, you're one of our required texts. And a question that my students wanted me to ask you is, how does the sacred Black feminine embrace themes of womanism and feminism?
Yeah, I see it as hand in hand. And I honestly would argue that a lot of womanist and feminist thinking is ultimately matriarchal thinking. Because it's deeper than Western ideology and Western consciousness, which I think is really held a lot of our feminist ideas hostage. But I think that the lineage of the mother, the way of centering the needs of the community and organizing communities and spiritual communities around need rather than production, feels very womanist to me. Feels very Black feminist to me, particularly because Black feminists and womanists have always been interested in what's happening on the ground and who's getting left behind. And I think as I look at the different streams that lead to the sacred Black feminine, you see that same matriarchal impulse of who is everybody. Let's do a head count first. Let's see if everybody's even here. And then also, what are the impediments that are preventing some people from being truly in, and how can we address those? So for example, in candomblé, you see that the priestesses are also very passionate about trans inclusion, very passionate about centering folks that would be called disabled or needy, either mentally or physically. And those are often the folks who have the most important roles in the spiritual community, particularly in the ceremonies. And they do the same thing with animals. Nothing really gets left behind. There's an intentionality around that as what it means to be spiritual, what it means to be holy. And so that just feels very in alignment with a lot of like Black feminists and womanists, and honestly, mujerista thinking. Yeah.
Thank you. So to expand on that question, you introduced the matriarchal God or supreme being. And how does a matriarchal God or supreme being offer liberative and expansive ways of knowing for the eradication of white supremacist systems?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because when I first encountered the sacred Black feminine, I was still faculty at Duke Divinity School, which is like, is there a more phallic place on earth? I don't know, right? And so I was kind of in that mindset of I have to prove that the sacred Black feminine is the answer to everything. And so I really started with a more social, psychological, social science approach, which, is a valid approach in the sense that if you're dealing with whiteness and patriarchy, which are probably some of the pillars of oppression in our society, then an antidote to that strategically from a social science perspective would be Blackness and matriarchy or Blackness and femininity. Although, of course, not all women are being a woman and being feminine are not the same thing, but they're often aligned. And so it's been interesting to notice that, yes, that is true, but I don't have to, that's not all that the sacred Black feminine offers us, but it is one of the really powerful things that the sacred Black feminine offers us. If you have been poisoned by white patriarchy, then why wouldn't Black matriarchy help you be aware and also dismantle and kind of divest from in your own body? And so I think she's strategic, and she's also beyond strategy, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely.
Can I just add a little piece to that?
Absolutely.
Again, thinking social, from a social science perspective, if you look at the pecking order in our society, who's at the top and who's at the bottom, it's pretty predictably organized along race and gender, with white men being at the top, particularly white cis hetero men, Christian men, and then Black women, particularly Black trans women, being at the bottom. And so one of the things that I think the sacred Black feminine does is it affirms the sacredness of those folks who are at the bottom. And in doing so, helps us to notice, wait, we live in a society where those folks are at the bottom. I've had folks read my book and be like, I never really thought critically, even Black folks, I never really thought critically about how Black femininity isn't seen as sacred until I read this book. So she, the sacred Black feminine kind of invited them to even wake up on a level, because we get used to this. This is just the life. And so we assume that this is how it always should be, or we don't question why Black femininity is often seen as unholy, as untrustworthy. But I think having to grapple with a divine entity that is holy and trustworthy, but is also Black and feminine, awakens in us the ways in which we need healing and the ways in which our society needs healing.
Yes, for sure.
It's shocking in a way. Part of what she shocks us into truth.
Yes. I was thinking along those same lines, because for practitioners of Abrahamic traditions, what are some of the ways you believe that they can expand their own theological imagination to embrace the sacred Black feminine within their own traditions?
Yeah. Mary. Well, I guess Jewish folks might be a little bit different, so maybe more Shekinah, but I mean, Sufis have been loving Mary. I mean, if you read Rumi is obsessed with Mary. I mean, Rumi loves Jesus, but Rumi loves Mary. And so I think there's already a place of importance for within at least Judaism and Christianity, or importance. I mean, she's been so relegated, but there's a way to reclaim her because she already exists. And I would say the same thing for the Shekinah in the Jewish story, is this idea of these stories already exist. What have we lost in the telling of them? How is the church, how is patriarchy in the church made palatable who these entities have been? So that's one way. Another way that I think is really important for Christians and people who come from a Jewish background is to really interrogate and investigate what happened in the Exodus story. And womanists have already helped us with that. But I remember throwing the book I was reading across my room and kind of like making a dent in the wall when I learned that the people who were colonized by the Israelites as they left Egypt were all Black and brown people who worshiped a Black goddess. And so I think Christianity and Judaism really need to grapple with that reality, that part of the goddess who was available to them, they were told to annihilate and to, so I think facing that reality is challenging, but womanists have written about that. So it's not like we don't have support as we do that.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Could you share with us, how has embracing and embodying the sacred Black feminine allowed you to stop contouring professionally and personally? And then what are some tools that you can share with us to support us on our journey?
Yeah. So that's the thing that's so powerful about the sacred Black feminine is because she's so embodied, because there's so many spiritual pathways that lead to her that are really embodied. There's an invitation to stop just knowing things and to actually start being different in the world. And I remember, about 5 years ago now, I walked 400 miles across central France to visit 18 different Black Madonnas. And after I was coming back from the 17th, I had a moment of just time to reflect because I was going to be heading home in a couple days. And I was like, I could go home. I could get a book deal. I could write a really great book and that would be fine. Or I could go home and be transformed. Mm-hmm. And so I asked myself, what would it look like for me to go home? And every time I'm faced with the decision, I ask, if God is a Black woman, then how will that impact how I respond to this question? And so I was going back home thinking, if God is truly a Black woman, then why am I still in so many toxic patriarchal relationships? If God is a Black woman, what does that look like for my bank account and my budget and who I'm sharing resources with and who I'm not? If God is a Black woman, then why do I still work at a place that I know is not healthy for me? Why am I afraid to step out into the unknown if God is a Black woman? Because if God is a Black woman, she's got my back and she wants me to flourish. So I can leave relationships, I can venture into new spaces, into the unknown, I can leave toxic work situations, I can be okay with uncertainty around my spirituality of origin and start asking questions that, frankly, the answer might just break my heart. And so I think what connecting with the sacred Black feminine has allowed me to do is to really put a litmus test up to my life. If God is a Black woman, then I'm sacred too. Therefore, is this whole situation sacred? And it's pretty funny because I work with a team of all exclusively younger folks, Gen Zers and younger millennials. And one of them who's been working with me for a few years said, if there's anything I take away from working with you for a few years is that I'm too sacred for all of this. Yeah, she's like, I walk into rooms and I'm like, I'm too sacred for this. And I just walk out. And I'm like, I love that. That's what the sacred Black feminine. I mean, I think, Alice Walker said it well, Black women are the mules of the world. We have been taught that the only way to survive is to stay being a mule. And we've been taught that the only way to have health insurance is to stay being a mule. The only way to have love is to stay being a mule. The only way to have security around our salvation or around our spiritual well-being is to stay being a mule. And I feel like the Black Madonna and the sacred Black feminine say, you're sacred. So what does that mean for you? And can you trust me? And before I encountered the sacred Black feminine, I was just dealing with white patriarchal God, essentially, even though I grew up in Kojic spaces, it was still white patriarchal God. And at the end of the day, I could not surrender to him. And at first I gaslit myself, being like, oh, if I were just more faithful, if I just fast some more, if I just pray some more. And then I eventually realized he's actually not trustworthy. He does not have my back. And so it makes sense that I don't trust him. But now I believe God is a Black woman. And so I'm like, well, Black women handle it. It's handled.
Yes. Absolutely.
Women almost never let me down. And if a Black woman lets me down, it's because of systemic issues. It's not because Black women are untrustworthy. It's not because Black women are trying to harm me. And so if I can just connect with that truth that, okay, Black women are trustworthy, sacred Black feminine is trustworthy, then how do I really act out in faith, knowing that I have this base to cling to? And how is that really and not just in ways that make me feel warm and cuddly, but also like, Christena, what are you doing to eradicate the transphobia that lives within you? What are you doing about that? Because if you're sacred, all are sacred. It doesn't matter what you were trained to believe, doesn't matter what the preachers are saying, so it's really, it's invited me to get really serious about living out my faith.
Okay, thank you for your response. That's a bridge to the next question. And you've begun to answer it already. In what ways how does one utilize the sacred Black feminine to create and develop their own theology?
I love that. I actually just got a wonderful email from a Black trans person who is now forging their own kind of sacred Black trans God, which is amazing. So I think, my part of the reason why I shared so much of my story in the book was to give people an idea of what it looks like to claim your sacredness in the divine. Do I think that everybody needs to believe that God is a Black woman? Not necessarily. I think that's good for everybody to believe. I think you're not going to lose if you believe that. But at the end of the day, I want everyone to find themselves in the divine, regardless of where they come from or who they are. And so I think following this pathway and then kind of leaving a trail for other people, I think creates opportunities for more of us to imagine a divine being who stands with us and for us. And it also enlarges our heart for other people, because when we feel safe and loved, we're going to be a lot more invested in making sure that other people feel safe and loved. I know that I tend to fall into control when I'm experiencing fear. When I want to be controlling other people, what they believe, what they think, who they love, all that's my fear. And so I think that's really wonderful. And honestly, I didn't make this up, like I don't know where I would be without the stories of other people, and in particular Black women who forged their own path, like the womanists, who basically said, we love Black liberation theology and it's not enough. And so we're going to add our own piece. And the Mihadistas have done that too. And when I was early on in my journey, I was reading a lot of Palestinian liberation theologians. And so this is a tradition within marginalized groups, even within Christianity, to interpret scripture the way that feels life-giving to you. And I don't even think I would have that impetus if it weren't for like just really imaginative Black preaching.
Lachey. So, womanist ethicist and scholar Dr. Emily Towns, she stated that liberation is a process and freedom is a journey. So using that as a model, how could we begin to explore, embrace, and embody the sacred Black feminine in this white supremacist system?
Yeah. I would say do things like what I'm doing, like take classes on Tara, like just immerse yourself. I mean, it's challenging because a lot of these opportunities exist outside of the academy. It's unlikely that someone in the academy is going to teach a class on Tara and what she means for suffering.
Right.
But thankfully, because of Zoom and other resources, we can do that. But I also think it starts with us. I think one of the things that like womanism has really taught me is that I'm the sacred Black feminine, and that I can ask myself what I think about scripture or any other holy texts. And I also think that the sacred Black feminine exists in other Black people of all genders. And so it's important for me to open myself, particularly to the most marginalized, and see them as the preachers, not just the people that would get published by a university press. And so I think this is a mystical process where, yes, on the one hand, it's nice to learn the stories and it's nice to learn the histories and it's nice to learn facts. But also, I feel like we affirm and connect with the sacred Black feminine when we just exercise a no, that we don't know why. I'm just feeling it in my gut. This is a no. And we actually engage that and don't gaslight it. And I think one of the ways we do that is in community, connecting with folks who can affirm our sacredness and are genuinely asking, how do you feel about this situation, as opposed to thus saith the Lord.
Yes, self-empowerment.
And so any spiritual practices that cultivate an inner knowing. So I've spent a lot of time doing embodiment practices, and there's so many spaces to do that where you're actually learning how to connect with your sensations, your feelings, your truth. No, yeah, I mean, and that's taken a lot of work. It's not something that has felt intuitive because I've spent so much of my life contorting myself into something that's acceptable to this white patriarchal society. And so I was so disconnected from myself and my truth. And people would say, how do you feel about this? And I'm like, is that even relevant? Also, I don't know how to connect with those feelings.
Yes, that's real. That's really true. So I want to open it up to the audience to see if they have a question for you while we have you for this time. So if you have a question, you are welcome to put it in the chat box or to come off of mute and ask it of Dr. Cleveland while we have her here.
Kiana, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Off the top of your head, to talk about the sacred Black feminine and Yoruba traditions.
Oh, absolutely. So I'm actually initiated to Ifa as well as Oshun.
Okay.
And so Oshun is my sacred divine mother. And there's no either or in Ifa, right? So we have deities that represent, masculine energy as well as feminine energy and androgynous as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you speak about embracing everyone, literally in our spiritual tradition, everyone has a sacred place. And when in a sacred place that's inclusive, that's welcoming. So no one sits outside of in the margins within our traditions. All is welcome, from the animals to the children. And we have rituals. We wake up with rituals, and throughout our day, we practice rituals to keep us aligned, and in touch with our body and our spirit and our own divinity. So, yes.
Thank you.
Yes. So I have questions, and I have more questions. I don't want to dominate the conversation, I wanted to open it up. So does anyone have a question for Dr. Cleveland? Yes, Diane.
I'll start us off. I'm sure everyone does. So just as you spoke of your experience at Duke University, or as you came back to this very uh, patriarchal setting, and put that mildly, um, for myself, I, in contrast to Kiona, in many ways work within the Catholic tradition. And so very white patriarchal is in a dominant way. What first steps, how did you step back into Duke University after this transformation? And what did you suggest to those of us that find ourselves in a heavily patriarchal religious context? What are your first, what are your suggestions, or what were your first steps?
Yeah, that's such a fun question. Two things come to mind off the top of my head. One is I came back armored. And one of the things I love about the tradition of the Black Madonna is, and this is very Catholic, is, you have your necklace, you have your rosary beads, you have your little statue, like there's an embodied aspect of Catholicism, particularly folk Catholicism. And I remember coming back from my Black Madonna pilgrimage and having a necklace that I had bought while I was there of the Black Madonna. And I carried that with me back onto campus, knowing I'm not alone. Like she's pilgrimaging with me now. I'm surrounded, I'm connected, and I would hold onto it, or a little tiny Black Madonna. Not long after my pilgrimage, I went to Costa Rica to see the Black Madonna there, La Negrita, and I found a little tiny pocket shrine of her, and I would carry that and even hold it in meetings, and as this visceral reminder. And it was funny because I just started doing that. And then I realized that's actually a really common thing for Catholic people to do, is to kind of have these like little pocket shrines, or you can find them all over on Etsy that are vintage, So that's one thing that I did, is I brought her with me, even in small ways, onto campus. Another thing is I got connected. I was able to invite her into helping me see what was real and what wasn't real in that space. And so in that space, it seems like tradition, hierarchy, accolades, publications, those are the only things that matter. That these bishops in the Methodist Church, because Duke is Methodist, these bishops hold all the cards. And it actually, years before I went on my pilgrimage, I spent some time in Seattle, and I got to know a woman who's deeply Catholic, but also deeply feminist. And at the time, she was the provost at Gonzaga. And so I talked to her and I said, how can you possibly be a woman and work as the provost at Gonzaga? Like you're about as high ranking as any person with a uterus could possibly be in the Catholic Church, at least in the academic world. And her response, because I was like, doesn't it just frustrate you? Like, why are you there? Why haven't you given up? Like, what you could be a provost anywhere if you're the provost at Gonzaga. He just looked at me and was like, meh, the bishops will die. And I just remember thinking, like, that's so morbid. Also, are you planning a hit on the bishops? Like, what do you, I don't know. It was just her way of being like, they think they're it. They're not it. They're out there making laws and, digging their heels in and swaying the cardinals and doing all the things that they do. But she was like, but I'm connected to a greater source. And I think that in the end, the bishops won't be here and the truth will be here. Liberation will be here. And so it kind of goes back to that. So I think to me, it reminds me of MLK's quote. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And so I came back choosing to immerse myself in mystical practices that helped me remember what was true in the context of a very physically, Duke is so, in most academia, is so chained to the physical world. It's really hard to have any connection to mysticism in those spaces. And so those are the practices that I focused on, so I could have that attitude that she has, even as the bishops are doing horrible things, to just keep in mind, Yeah, but they're not God.
Mhm.
And I'm protected, you know, and I had my necklace to remind me that they can't really get me.
Ashe, give
They
thanks.
could fire me, they could, you know, demote me, they could do a bunch of things, but at the end of the day, I'm sacred.
Ashe,
Yeah.
definitely.
Thank you.
Uh,
That's so helpful. Thank you.
there's a question in the box. Olivia asked, who was the sacred Black feminine that the Hebrews left? I'm not familiar with that in Exodus.
Oh, okay. So she doesn't exist. Well, so she doesn't exist in scripture explicitly, but all of the from my research, all of the divine, all of the spiritualities of the people in Canaan were rooted in a divine feminine who was understood to be Black. And so when you talk about like the worship of Baal, Baal was the male consort of a female goddess who's not really named in scripture, usually, or very, very sparsely named. And so those, a lot of times the impetus to squash these spiritualities was, even though the consort was named, it was a goddess who had more power, who was the real threat. And so they were hoping to squash those spiritualities, and they were successful. When they colonized Canaan, those religions died and were replaced by Yahweh. Yeah.
Yes, I remember that from Old Testament.
Yeah, and you know, I'm trying to think of the book. There's a really powerful book that looks at the divine feminine in the Old Testament, in the first temple. And I read it a few years ago. That was really helpful and wonderful. So I can try to find that and send it to you, Kiana, but yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then I'll share it with the group.
Yeah.
So before we conclude our time together, Dr. Cleveland, if you can provide us with like 3 takeaways that when we can, as we conclude this conversation, what will help us in
Yeah.
embracing and learning more about the sacred Black feminine?
I would say find the people in your find the women in your tradition who have been most hated and study them. And why. So I'll give an example. Even when I was a little girl growing up in the Christian church, I could never understand why Paul the Apostle was so fixated on the goddess of Ephesus. Like I was just, Paul comes for her multiple times and is like, you're a good Christian if you reject this goddess and disempower her. And when I finally did the research on who that goddess was, it was Black Artemis.
Mm.
Artemis in the ancient world was like a B-level goddess, except for at Ephesus. She was a super goddess, and the goddess of Ephesus was Black. So all the Artemi, I guess that'd be the word, all the Artemi of the ancient world were white, generally speaking, except for the one of Ephesus, and she was Black, and she was like a super goddess. So it's interesting that right there is the sacred Black feminine. And yet, you know, it just completely flies under the radar. I would say the same thing about Kali. Like if you get really into particularly kind of more traditional conservative views within Hinduism, there's a lot of vitriol for Kali. And then if you go and actually spend some time in a Kali temple and experience the power there, you can awaken to the sacred Black feminine. So I would say that's one, like find the people in your tradition, particularly the women in your tradition that have been most vilified. I would say connect with your body and connect with your inner knowing, because that's awakening the sacred feminine within you. And then I would say rest. Yeah, there's as much as there's an impetus for pilgrimage or like drawing near physically to the sacred Black feminine, there's an impetus for being held. There's an invitation for being held. And you see that a lot in the traditions. where there will be a whole long ceremony that's like 2 days, and 90% of it is really just like resting or eating or being together. And it's not this like very intentional, well, it's not what we would call theological work, even though it's part of this really beautiful ceremony that is deeply theological. And so what does it mean to rest in as an individual, but also rest in community as spiritual practice? And how does that connect us with the sacred Black feminine, who
Yes,
is transforming us from mules to people who just walk into spaces and say, oh, I'm too sacred for this.
absolutely. One more question. A guest asked, they are a Hindu practitioner, and she says, I offer my prayers to sacred Black divine vision of Mother Goddess Kali, and I truly value equal rights to emancipation. My question is related to a different tradition, though, Judaism. I'm not an expert in it, but I recall I read in the Hebrew Bible in the Book of Kings that when the Israelites arrived to Phoenicia, they encountered child sacrifices and male prostitutes. How can we ensure that the Phoenician model truly represents compassion and motherly love towards all?
That's a really good question. So I'm curious. So I'm curious about a few things. One, the lens, like who wrote about the Phoenician goddess and those practices,
Mm-hmm.
and what were their biases, and what were their what were their goals. In most of the research that I've done suggests that the Levites and the folks who had a lot of power in the telling of those stories were very motivated to spin the stories as these people are bad, therefore they are worthy of genocide. And so I think that's one thing to look at. Also, I would just get curious about, trying to look at different interpretations of it. And, if child sacrifice was part of it, how and why? And are we looking at it through a kind of a modern lens, or are we looking at it through a different lens? How can I approach this without judgment? I know that was really challenging for me when I spent time with Candomblé priestesses, because they do a lot of animal sacrifice, which to my American sensibility just seemed really cruel. And and unfortunately, like in a colonial way, I was seeing it as, backwards, just all these, just bringing a lot of judgment to it. And so I would say, be curious. And also I would say, goddess religions were as institutionalized as Christianity and Judaism and Hinduism and Islam are today. So they weren't pure in the sense of, there's some people who say, oh, if we just return to the goddess religions. And I'm like, they weren't they were still run by humans too. And
Exactly.
so
Yes.
it's possible that there really was child sacrifice going, and it was just, after doing all the research, it was just ghastly, and so then you use that as a teachable moment. And I think one of the things that's powerful for me is looking at all the ways in which white patriarchy still shows up in the mask of the sacred Black feminine. Because I think white male God is a shapeshifter and will take any opportunity to breathe into a space as a way to control. And so I think I'm sure there are really robust examples of that happening even within those institutionalized goddess religions.
I would agree. I agree. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for your time, Dr. Cleveland, and for being with us
Yes.
in your sacred. Yes, if you can share about any upcoming events that you may have, and I can also send it out to our network as well.
Sure, yeah. So in terms of the Black Madonna, I'm heading to Paris in a couple months, and we still have 2 more spots. This is the last week to sign up. So if you're interested if you're Black, non-binary, or Black woman, you're invited to join us. So we're going to go see some Black Madonnas in Paris in May. And I also, I would invite you to join my email list, join my Patreon. I'm writing about the Black Madonna every month in my Patreon too. And so that's a great way to learn as I'm learning, because I'm researching right now for my next book. And so just last week, I learned of an amazing story about the Black Madonna and a really powerful enslaved people revolt and how she empowered it. So there's just so much to learn about. So yeah, those are great ways to stay in touch.
Wonderful. Everyone, we will definitely send out the link to Dr. Cleveland's website, and then you can find everything there's to know about Dr. Cleveland there so you can stay connected and informed. Again, thank you so much for everything, your sacred yes, and being with us today. Go in beauty, Dr. Cleveland. May peace be with you, and I'm sure we shall meet again.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Bye.